I was reading about some urban legend stories late at night when I came across the title, The Licked Hand. But since I was getting sleepy, I put my phone down and went to sleep. I was awake with a weird sound in the middle of the night. I checked the time, and it was 1:30 a.m. At first, it sounded like someone was scratching something, but then hearing it closely with full attention, it was as if something was dripping. Thinking it might be coming from any of the taps, I tried to ignore it, and still, I didn't go to check on it because I was too scared. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but the sound was too disturbing. Unintentionally, my focus continued to go in that direction. The sounds of droplets falling one after another became clearer and clearer the more I focused on it. It started to feel spooky, like one of those horror movies we watch where the ghost appears and similar situations occur. Even though I didn't believe in ghosts, I wasn't brave either. Living alone in a new apartment where I had recently shifted, there were too many reasons to feel alarmed and scared, since I didn't have complete assurance of this place. It had been like this ever since I left home. Even though I would often get scared of little things, I would simply just close my eyes and act like it wasn't. I was living just fine before I met Mason, my ex-boyfriend. Guess I didn't tell you why I moved from my last apartment. It was because the two of us lived in the same apartment, and he was such a jerk that he did not once feel ashamed bringing other girls to his apartment just after our breakup. So I moved out and found a new apartment to live in. But since it had only been 2 days, I couldn't help but feel scared at every little sound. I thought if the sounds were coming from some leaky pipes, then I would just need to talk to the building owner the next morning. But for tonight, I had to endure it and get through with it no matter what. As the pit-pat of the dripping sound got louder and louder, I tightened my already wrapped blanket around me even more. The noise was getting ominous and frightening, but I was too scared to get out of the bed and find out what it was. There was one thing that I was assured about my dog sleeping under my bed, and it was her habit. So if anything were to happen, she would protect me. I wrapped a part of the blanket around my ears so that I could block the terrifying dripping sound and clenched my eyes tighter to sleep. It didn't make any difference either way, but I continued doing that for another hour. At this point, the sleep was long gone from my eyes, and I was just lying on the bed with closed eyes, listening to the noise, which felt like the dripping was going on inside my ears. I wanted to go and check, but the feeling of being scared was overwhelming my other senses, so I stayed still. The awareness of being alone in the apartment had been highlighted to the extent that I was regretting ever leaving my home, even though they never once treated me nicely. I even regretted moving to this apartment, thinking maybe I should have stayed there and stayed ignorant of him. But then as I was thinking this, I suddenly thought of the dog under the bed. So I reached my hand toward the floor for reassurance from my dog. After a second, he licked it, making me feel a little relieved. Even though it was not enough, it was like I got a water drop to drink in a dry, hot desert. I pulled the blanket over my head and yet again tried to sleep. Another 2 hours passed, and the dripping sound hadn't stopped. Instead, it got louder and clearer, making my heart beat louder from the terrifying feeling. I thought of finally checking and stopping it from the source, so I got up, hesitantly walking slowly to where the sound was coming from. I stopped in front of the bathroom near the stairs. The dripping noise was loudest in there, so I hesitantly walked in there. But the moment I turned the light on, a scream left my throat as I fell backward. The brutally mutilated body of a dog was hanging in the shower. Half of his skin was on the floor, covered in blood, and the dripping sound that was coming for hours was his blood slowly dripping onto the tiles from his body. On the bathroom mirror was badly written with the dog's blood, were the words, "Not just dogs, but humans can lick hands too." I started to feel suffocated, as if someone had stopped the breathing mechanisms from my body, and my licked hands started to burn. This was the first time that I was experiencing such a terrifying feeling as I was about to die. My eyes started to fall backward on their own, and I tried to scream, but my voice didn't come from my throat. The bathroom started to get closer along with the dog's body, and as my consciousness gradually shifted away from me, I realized something. The only broken words that came in my mouth were, "But how? When I don't even have a dog?" That was when I jolted awake with a heavy panicked breath and looked around to get an understanding of the surrounding. I was inside my room. My entire body was sweating, and in my hands I had the same story opened as last night, The Licked Hand. That was when I remembered that I was going to sleep, but then I was too curious after reading the title that I opened the story and read it, but fell asleep while reading. Guess what I just had was a result of that. I guessed that it was just a nightmare. I looked at the time again. It was already 7 in the morning. I was about to get late for work. I closed my phone and put it onto the bedside table, then walked to the bathroom. As I was about to enter, the scene from the nightmare flashed in my mind, so I hesitated for a second. But then I shook my head and went in to get ready for work, because I had a reality ahead. Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so. So it was the middle of the night to 1999. I was probably around 6 or 7. My brothers and I shared a room in our little duplex home. Just so everyone knows, even though these duplexes are old, I've lived in a few, and my family and I have never experienced anything paranormal in one before. So this is the only real time I've ever experienced anything that scared me like this. I woke up in the middle of the night sometime. I've always had trouble sleeping. So for me, it was just another normal tossing and turning session late at night. Or at least, that was what I thought. As I lay in bed trying to get comfortable, I suddenly hear a child crying. This did not alarm me at first because, like I said, I shared a room with my 2 brothers. They're younger than me, and at times I would have to remind them that it was just a bad dream when they would wake up. But it looked down to the bottom bunk to check on them, and they were both sound asleep. I looked towards the hallway to see if there was a light coming from the living room. Nothing. Everyone in the house was asleep. Now it was scared. The voice was that of a child. The child's voice suddenly spoke through its tears. "Let me, please." This scared me beyond all recognition at this point. It sounded like it was right there in the room with us. No one was making a sound. It was just a voice of a scared child begging through tears to let me in, please. And it went on for hours. I was so scared that I used my blanket as earmuffs to muffle the sound, and I eventually fell back asleep. But I never remembered the voice stopping. After that, I slept with my blankets wrapped around my ears to block out sound, and eventually a fan as well, until I moved out of my parents' house at 16. So I'm not sure if anyone else has experienced anything similar, or if anyone has their own theories. But I'm willing to hear them on the comments, because this was the scariest moment in my entire life. I was awake from the thumping sounds coming outside my room. Even though there was no one inside the room, I could feel something heaving, pressing over my chest. I tried to get up to see what or who was making all those noises outside my room, but I couldn't move. Unable to understand what was going on, I tried a few more times, only to get the same result. It felt as if my body was suddenly growing weights on its own, 10 times more than my normal one, and it was only pushing me down. That was when I saw a shadowy figure coming inside through the closed doors and slowly approaching me. The panic feeling and struggles to get away didn't help me come out of my paralysis state. The shadow appeared to be of a human being, but I knew for sure it was a ghost. It sat over my chest and extended its hands to my neck. I had a feeling of trepidation rush over my brain amid him grabbing my neck and choking me. He continued doing so for about 5 to 7 minutes, and what I felt throughout that time frame can only be described as pure agony. For some reason, my paralysis state broke, and in attempts to get away from him, I fell to the floor, only to open my eyes in my bed in the same position I fell asleep. I immediately got up and scanned my room to see if that man was still there. Thank God he wasn't. I ran out of my room to the living room, where I found my mom and brother watching television. They turned their heads to see my panicked state and started asking questions with worried expressions. When I repeated the incident that had just taken place in my room word for word, along with the lines that my room was haunted. "Our house is not haunted, you just had a sleep paralysis," my brother said, and went back to watching whatever's streaming on television. I looked at him dumbfounded when my mom told me that they had also suffered from the same thing at least once in the past, and it was not a frequent thing. It somehow calmed me down, thinking it won't happen again. So I went to the kitchen to drink some water. I opened the top shelf of the refrigerator and took out a glass of water. I remember hiding a Coca-Cola bottle behind all the water bottles, but it wasn't there anymore. I turned around in anger to ask my brother if he had taken it, but he wasn't there, and neither was my mom. The television was still on, and the show that they were watching was still playing. It was weird because the streaming show was according to Jim, which went off the air in 2009. Something didn't add up. Were they broadcasting it again? I looked toward the channel's logo to confirm, and it was for sure NBC. "Mom, are they rebroadcasting the show?" I asked out loud, enough for Mom to hear if she was inside the house. But there was no response. Did they leave for somewhere? But when? I got up and walked around looking for them, and there was no one there. I was alone. That was when I snapped back to my room within a few seconds. I started panicking, and as I was facing the door, I felt exceedingly anxious and apprehensive about turning back to see what was standing behind me, because the way I was brought into this room, I was sure my nightmare hadn't ended yet. I tried opening the door to run out of the room, but it seemed stuck for some reason, and no matter how many times I tried it, it didn't open. As I made the last failed attempt to open the door, I heard a hysterical laughter from whoever was standing in the middle of my room. Trust me, I didn't want to, but I turned around anyway and saw what looked like an alien bluish creature looking straight into my eyes, sending a cold chill down my body. It felt so real, to the point where I had started to think that all of this wasn't a dream, but reality. I tried screaming, but my voice just wouldn't come out of my mouth. My heart was thumping like crazy, as if it was ready to jump through my mouth at any second now. I held my head with my hands and sat down on the floor right where I was standing. My breathing started to get heavy, unable to maintain a constant pace, and my entire body started trembling. I had no idea what to do and how to get out from this nightmare. So I clenched my eyes tighter, hoping to be awake when I opened them. And I did find myself in the room lying on my bed. But again, I was unable to move apart from my eyes. This time, there was no one else in the room except for me, which was a relief. But my body was still in the state of paralysis. A light knock appeared on my bedroom door. I felt terrified, because I thought the shadowy figure would enter again. Someone knocked again 2 times and called out my name, asking if I was awake. I recognized the voice. It was my brother, Charlie. I tried to move my body, and thank God I was able to. I rushed to my door and opened it. "What happened, brother? I heard your scream." How can anyone explain what just transpired with me? Even if I was unsure if I'm awake this time or if this is also part of the dream. So I just told him that I was having a nightmare. "What time is it?" As he was about to leave, I asked. 4:16 p.m., he said, looking at his wristwatch. I remembered sleeping at 2 in the afternoon, so it must be right. But I still wanted to make sure I was awake. So I rushed to the kitchen. Mom was there doing the dishes. To check for the Coca-Cola bottle I hid before sleeping, I opened the refrigerator and took a sigh of relief when I found it. "Mom, is the show according to Jim streaming on NBC?" She looked at me in confusion when I asked, that as if I was uttering some nonsense. "I don't think it is anymore. It already ended back in 2009, she said, getting back to doing her chores. Why in the world did I see that in my dream? As I was trying to understand it, I remembered something. That's what they were watching when I rushed to my mom and brother after experiencing sleep paralysis for the first time. So that part was about the first time I told them.
Born in a relatively small family in the Indian city of Nagpur, Aku Yadav became something of a local menace as he grew older. As he entered his late teens, the miscreant child had graduated into a full-time criminal, and given how frighteningly intelligent the boy seemed to be, it wasn't long before he was running his own cartel of cruel and violent thugs. The gang ruled over the Kasturba Nagar slum they called home, robbing, killing, and torturing all those who stood in their way, and with near impunity. After just a few years, Aku found he rarely needed to resort to violence anymore. The atmosphere of fear he and his underlings had cultivated meant he'd made most of his money from simple extortion, and he made weekly rounds to collect protection money that each small business owed him. That, and leaving dead bodies around the slum, was a massive inconvenience for him. It meant he'd have to pay handsome bribes to local police officers to ensure his little fiefdom went untouched. Murder was bad for business. However, Aku found a form of punishment much more suited to his mode of operation: indecent assault. As we've mentioned, murder was only likely to cause even more trouble for Aku and his gang, and part of their problem was figuring out how to effectively silence those who stood against them. A person could recover from a beating, one that would most likely just make them angry. But in India, as with many parts of the world, being the victim of an indecent assault can be a very stigmatizing event. Attack a woman in that manner, and she wouldn't breathe a word to anyone, and what's more, you effectively have something to hold over her, a piece of information one might use to manipulate and coerce. It's a form of terrorism that Aku employed on a yearly basis, and those who fell victim to it had absolutely no form of legal recourse. Handsome police bribes ensured that no investigation would be opened, allowing Aku and his minions to rob, assault, and intimidate at will. Some Kasturba Nagar residents said that every single shack or cramped apartment in the entire slum housed some victim of Aku's horrifying malice, the youngest of which was a 10-year-old girl. In one incident, Aku personally took the life of a woman named Asha Bai. "We were eating dinner when he came to the front door and pretended to be a friend of my brother," said Asha's daughter. "When my mother opened the door, he dragged her out and stabbed her. He then cut off her ears for her earrings and her fingers because he could not get her rings." Asha's mother, a woman named Anjana Bai Bukhar, was also forced to witness her death. Another woman described how she and her husband were attacked by Aku in the middle of the night. He arrived at our house at around 4 or 5 in the morning, banging loudly on the door and telling us he was from the police. When my husband opened the door, Aku stabbed him in the thigh, almost completely immobilizing him. Then, in full view of my husband, Aku violated me over and over again, until long after the sun had risen. The number of accounts like that are seemingly endless, with some of the worst describing how Aku defiled women in the hours after they were married, or how he cut off another's chest after her daughter was unable to pay her protection money. But perhaps the worst account is the story of how Aku carnally violated a woman just 10 days after she'd given birth. The shame was too much for her, and as a result, the woman marched into a bustling marketplace, doused herself in kerosene, then set herself on fire. Finally, after years of terrorizing the Kasturba Nagar slums, the police decided that Aku's iron-fisted rule had to be curtailed. Numerous attempts to ban him from the area, including being detained for over a year under emergency powers, was completely ineffective. Aku simply delegated to his lieutenants who still operated in the slums or ignored the rulings entirely. What's more, Aku had found a way to kill and maim with complete impunity by targeting the minority communities known as Dalits. With their name rooted in the Sanskrit word for broken, the Dalits belong to those inhabiting the lowest caste in Indian society and are often known simply as the Untouchables. They are subjected to some horrendous forms of bigotry, and according to a 2007 report by International Human Rights Watch, the treatment of Dalits is India's hidden apartheid, and that the Dalits endure segregation in housing, schools, and access to public services. Needless to say, the police weren't so interested in investigating crimes committed against the Dalits. They didn't even ask for bribes to keep them quiet. Yet what's clear is that, despite the fear Coup had instilled in the Kasturba Nagar slums, the people could only take so much abuse before they began to lash out. And it seems that any serious and organized resistance began with a woman named Usha Narayani. You see, Usha refused to be intimidated by Coup and his goons, and continually demanded that local police take action against him on her behalf. Every single day she called by to check if her complaints were being dealt with, and each time, she took her indignation further and further up the chain of command. But instead of actually dealing with her complaint, the police warned Coup that Usha was causing trouble for them and needed to be dealt with. And so, that night, Coup and 40 of his most brutal foot soldiers surrounded Usha's home and demanded she come out. It was reported that Coup carried only one weapon, a bottle of sulfuric acid, and told Usha if she merely withdrew her police report, that everything would be fine. She refused. Coup then began to bark out, "I'll throw acid on your face, and you won't be in a position to file any more complaints. If we ever meet you, you don't know what we'll do to you. Being violated is nothing compared to what we'll have in store. You hear me? Nothing. We'll burn you alive, cut you into pieces, and then feed you to stray dogs." Yet, instead of kowtowing to such threats, Usha began to barricade the doors to her home. This only infuriated the criminals, who made short work of the barricades and forced their way into the house. However, once they were inside, a frighteningly familiar smell graced their nostrils. It was the smell of gas, and standing before them, box of matches in hand, was Usha Narayani. "Get out of my house, or I will burn us all," she growled. And for the first time in a long time, Coup was the one who was terrified. They were forced to abandon the attack, but Coup obviously didn't take the defeat well, and began to plot a terrible revenge against the woman who had so embarrassed him. The next day, news of Usha's successful defiance spread like wildfire among the Kasturba Nagar slums. Many celebrated, but many also saw it as an opportunity to make even further gains from Coup and his men. Dalits flooded the streets, armed with sticks and stones, and began to attack Cou's lieutenants on sight. Then, on August 6th of 2004, a group of furious Dalits closed in on Cou's lavish house on the edge of the slums. They smashed their way inside, chased away the guards, looted the place, and then put it to the torch. The cheers and celebratory singing could be heard for miles around. Coup was on the run, and in a hilariously hypocritical twist, he turned to the police to protect him from the mob. And it's while he's in police custody that those wishing retribution against him began to make their moves. Coup was held in one single static location, a location known to thousands of Kasturba Nagar residents. And on the 13th of August 2004, they made their move. After hearing that Coup was about to be released after a corrupt bail hearing, hundreds of angry women marched down to the courthouse that Coup was being held at. At first, their gathering appeared to be a furious but relatively peaceful protest, and police even allowed a few of the women into the courtroom to bear witness to bail hearing, having assured them that it would be fair and impartial. Yet when Coup appeared in the courtroom at around 2:30 p.m., he was arrogant, disrespectful, and entirely unrepentant. When one woman took the stand to accuse him of violating her, Coup laughed out loud, mocking her and saying he'd do it again if he could. This elicited laughter from a few of the police officers in attendance. Some say the laughter was in response to how immature Coup was acting, but what's clear is that to the women on the stand, as well as those in attendance, the laughter was the final straw. One woman launched herself at Coup, taking off her sandal and striking him about the head with it. Officers of the court tried to restore order, and the sight of them protecting the very man who had terrorized them for so long sent the women into a frenzy. Yet what followed wasn't outright chaos, so much as orchestrated chaos. The women of Kasturba Nagar hadn't just shown up that day on a whim. Oh no, they had a plan. A plan that was perhaps as simple as it was effective. You see, the women who showed up to the court that day did so concealing all manner of bladed articles. They knew well that the Nagpur courthouse had metal detectors, ones that would easily reveal any kitchen knives or other steel weapons they tried to smuggle in. To get around that, the women of Kasturba Nagar had conspired to start something of a cottage industry, one focused solely on the production of what we might call prison shanks. They made knives out of plastic, out of wood, out of glass, and when they ran out of material, they made knives out of sharpened pieces of rock. But in addition to these deadly homemade blades, the women carried small baggies of what would prove to be a surprisingly effective non-lethal weapon: chili powder. So when the officers of the court moved to restrain them, all it took was one handful of chili powder blown into a cop's eyes, and he was out of the fight. Once all of the officers protected him had been incapacitated, Coup was no longer the cocky, gloating figure he'd been just minutes before. Instead, he begged for his life. "Forgive me, please," he said to have wailed. "I won't hurt anyone anymore. I'll leave Nagpur for good. None of you will ever hear from me again. Just please don't kill me." A single woman approached him, and the room fell silent. It was Anjana Bai Bukhar, whose daughter had been murdered by Coup before her very eyes. "Coup, Yadav," she began. "We can't both live on this earth together. It's either you or us." And with that, the attack began in earnest. It's thought that Coup Yadav was stabbed by almost 400 women that day as he lay helpless on the marble floor of the Nagpur courtroom. They had agreed to all stab him at least once, plunging the blades into his body before passing them on to the next woman. The women poured the remainder of the chili powder into his eyes and up his nostrils, while one began to slice off his reproductive organs before holding them above her head like a bloody trophy. Some say it took Coup at least 30 minutes to actually expire, and when he was dead, the entirety of the courtroom's bright white marble flooring was soaked in his blood. The man himself lay dead from literally hundreds of stab wounds at just 32 years of age. When the attack was finished, the women of Kasturba Nagar returned to their husbands and fathers to tell them that they had killed Coup Yadav. The entire slum seemed to burst into celebration. That night, families blasted out music into the streets, dancing and cheering in pure jubilation. Households gifted fruit and food to their neighbors, a tradition normally associated with the holiest of Hindu holidays. The police honed in on the woman who had given birth to the resistance, the same woman who had flooded her own house with gas before threatening to roast Coup and herself alive. Usha Narayani was arrested and charged with murder, but a crowd of 400 women and more than 100 men and children gathered at the courthouse, each saying that they were the ones solely responsible for Cou's murder. And as a result, no one could be charged, and in 2012, Usha was officially acquitted of all charges. Retired Indian High Court Judge Bahal Vahani publicly defended the woman who lynched Yadav, saying that, in the circumstance they underwent, they were left with no alternative but to finish Coup. The women repeatedly pleaded with the police for their security, but the police failed to protect them. If they took law into their own hands, it was because the law and law-enforcing agencies had not given them succor. Some did attempt to condemn the murder, saying that extrajudicial killings were completely unacceptable. And as much as they're legally and morally correct, there's no denying that the women of Kasturba Nagar were only capable of taking a certain amount of abuse before they decided to lash out and wreak a terrible retribution. And in the case of Coup Yadav, That retribution came in the form of an agonizing, terrifying, and drawn-out death, and arguably one that he very much deserved.